She said it like she meant it, quiet, certain, final. "You deserve someone better than me." Cole had heard a lot of things in his 38 years, but nothing had ever landed quite like that. He was still holding the screwdriver. Brody was sitting in the corner of that dark kitchen, watching his father, the way kids watch something they don't have words for yet. Cole set the screwdriver down on the counter, looked straight at her, and said 4 words that made Renee forget how to breathe. What did he say? Cole Hargrove had been an electrician for 16 years, and in that time, he had learned that most houses tell you everything about their owners before you ever meet them. The wiring in the lakeside house told him whoever owned it had money, good fixtures, clean panels, nothing cheap. But the dust on every surface told him something else. Nobody had been here in a long time. Nobody had wanted to be. He had taken the job because it paid well, and because it was 20 minutes from town, which meant Brody could ride with him instead of sitting in an empty house all summer. The contract came through a property management company out of Burlington. No name attached to the owner. Just a list of repairs, a set of keys, and a payment schedule that didn't require much conversation. Cole preferred it that way. He wasn't a man who needed a lot of explanation to do his job well. Brody was 8 years old and had his mother's eyes and his father's silence. He knew how to stay out of the way on a job site without being told he'd been coming along since he was 5, sitting in corners with his sketchbook or a book quiet, in the way only kids who've learned early that the world doesn't always stop for them can be quiet. Cole had never asked him to be that way. It had just happened, and there were days it made his chest ache in a place he couldn't point to. Their routine was simple. Cole worked. Brody drew or read near whichever window had the best light. At noon, they ate the sandwiches Cole packed, always the same turkey and mustard, because it was what Brody would actually finish, and then Cole went back to work, while Brody napped on the old couch in the front room with a jacket over him. People in town called Cole steady. Some meant it as a compliment, some didn't. He had stopped trying to figure out which was which a long time ago. On the 3rd day she arrived. Cole heard the car first gravel shifting under slow tires, an engine cutting off, then the sound of a door closing with the kind of deliberate quiet that people use when they don't want to announce themselves. He was under the kitchen sink rerouting a ground fault circuit when he heard the front door open. He stayed where he was and listened. Footsteps across hardwood. Not rushed, not cautious. Purposeful. Like someone who knew exactly where they were going. He came out from under the sink when the footsteps stopped in the main room. The woman standing near the far wall was somewhere in her early 40s, dressed plainly dark jeans, a gray button-down, no jewelry worth noticing. She hadn't seen him yet. She was looking at the shelf beside the fireplace, and she was adjusting something on it. A clock. An old mantel clock, dark wood brass face, the kind that belonged to a different era entirely. She moved it less than an inch to the left, then touched the glass cover with 2 fingers, barely a touch, the way you press your hand to something that belongs to you, something you were afraid you might not find still there. Cole stood in the kitchen doorway and didn't say anything. She turned when she finally noticed him, and her expression settled into something neutral so quickly that he wondered if what he'd seen a second before had actually been there at all. She said she was the property manager, that she'd be checking in on the work periodically, that he should continue as scheduled. She didn't offer a name. He didn't ask. Her name, he would learn later from Ray Duffin, who ran the building supply on Route 9, was Renee. Brody came in from the front room around 3 that afternoon, restless in the way 8-year-olds get when the afternoon drags. He was moving too fast through the main room. Cole heard it. Before it happened, that particular combination of sneakers on hardwood and something wobbling, and then the clock was off the shelf and on the floor, and the sound it made when it hit was not loud, but final. Cole came around the corner. Brody stood over the pieces with both hands pressed flat against the sides of his legs, his face gone still in the way that meant he was trying hard not to cry. Renee stood on the other side of the room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't say anything at all. She just looked at the pieces on the floor, and the silence that came off her was the kind that doesn't need volume to fill a room. Cole put his hand on Brody's shoulder and said quietly that it was okay. Go wait by the truck. Brody went, and Cole crouched down and began carefully picking up the pieces one by one without being asked. Ray Duffin talked while he loaded the truck the way he always did. Cole had come in for conduit fittings and left knowing more than he'd come for. Ray knew the lakeside property everyone in town did, in the vague way people know things they've never been told directly. The house had belonged to a woman who died 3 years back. Her daughter had been paying the taxes on it ever since, without ever coming back. Until now. And the clock on the shelf in the main room, Ray said, tilting his head like the detail mattered, that clock had been the mother's. Only thing the daughter had asked to be left exactly where it was. Cole drove back toward the lake and didn't turn the radio on. Brody sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window, still carrying the particular stillness of a child who knows he did something he can't undo. The afternoon light was long and flat across the water when they pulled up to the house, and Cole sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. He had two options. He could finish the job, collect the payment, and let the broken clock be what it was, an accident. Nobody's fault, the kind of thing that happens. Or he could do the other thing, the thing that wasn't required, wasn't asked for, and would cost him money he didn't have extra of. He looked at Brody, who was still staring out the window, and he thought about what he wanted his son to understand, about what a man does when something breaks that matters to someone else. It wasn't a long thought. It didn't need to be. He got out of the truck, took the pieces he'd wrapped in a shop cloth from the back seat, and looked up the nearest clock restoration shop on his phone. There was one in Montpelier 40 minutes away. He put the address in and told Brody to get his seatbelt back on. They were taking a drive. The restoration shop in Montpelier was run by an old man named Gerald, who smelled like machine oil and took 20 minutes to examine the clock before he said anything. He turned it over in his hands the way a doctor handles something fragile, squinting through a loop at the movement, checking the escapement, running his thumb along the case where the wood had split. He said it was repairable. He said it would take 3 days and cost $340. Cole said fine, and put down half up front, $170 as a deposit. Gerald looked at him over the top of his glasses, like he was waiting for a negotiation that never came, then wrote up the ticket without another word. $170 was nearly a quarter of what the full job at the lake house would pay, with the remaining balance due on pickup. Cole didn't do the math out loud. He just folded the receipt, put it in his shirt pocket, and took Brody to the diner 2 doors down, where they ate burgers and shared a slice of pie and didn't talk about the clock or Renee or any of it. Brody ate his half of the pie slowly, the way he did when he was thinking. Cole let him think. That was another thing the boy had gotten from his mother, the need to sit with things before he could say them. Back at the lake house the next morning, Cole worked and said nothing about Montpelier. Renee was there again. She'd apparently decided to stay on the property while the repairs were being completed, which the management company had not mentioned and which Cole had no grounds to object to. She sat up at the dining table with a laptop and worked in the kind of focused silence that suggested she was used to operating alone. She didn't get in his way. He didn't get in hers, but the house was small enough that there was no real distance between them. The friction started on the second day. Cole was rewiring the breaker panel in the utility room, taking his time to do it cleanly, and Renee appeared in the doorway to ask how much longer it would take. He told her 2 more days on that section alone. She said the management company had estimated the full job at 4 days total. Cole told her the management company hadn't looked at the panel. She said she needed a timeline she could plan around. He said he understood that. And then he went back to work because the panel wasn't going to fix itself while they discussed it, and there was nothing more to say. She came back an hour later with a revised list of priorities, things that needed to be done before others, an ordering system she'd clearly put together based on logic that made sense on paper, but less sense inside actual walls. Cole read through it, set it on the workbench, and continued with what he was already doing. He wasn't being difficult. He had simply been in enough houses to know that the order things got done in wasn't always the order someone looking at a spreadsheet would choose. Renee watched him for a moment, then left without commenting. That was how the first full day went. Brody characteristically made things more complicated. He had taken a liking to the front porch that overlooked the lake, and he spent most of his time out there drawing in his sketchbook. But whenever Renee moved through the main room, he talked to her. Not in the cautious way kids talk to adults they're unsure of. He just talked naturally, as if they'd already established that she was someone worth speaking to. He told her his dad burned grilled cheese every single time because he got distracted and forgot to flip it. He told her his mom had died when he was 4 and that he didn't remember her voice anymore. But he remembered that she smelled like the cedar closet in their old house. He said these things in the same tone, as if they carried equal weight, because to him, they probably did. Renee didn't respond the way most adults did. She didn't rush to fill the space with comfort or redirect the conversation. She just listened, and sometimes she nodded, and Brody seemed to find that satisfactory. Cole watched this from across the room and said nothing. On the 4th day, the receipt fell out of Cole's shirt pocket while he was pulling wire through the utility room ceiling. It landed face up on the floor near the doorway. He didn't notice. Renee did. She picked it up, read it, and was standing in the utility room doorway holding it when Cole came down off the ladder. She held the receipt out toward him. Her expression wasn't angry exactly, but it was tight in the way that meant she was keeping something controlled. She said she hadn't asked him to do that. She said she didn't need his pity, and she didn't want to be someone's good deed. Her voice was even precise, the voice of someone who had learned a long time ago to keep feeling out of the words they used. Cole took the receipt from her hand and looked at it for a second, then set it on the workbench. He said, "Brody broke it. Brody's responsible for it. That's how I'm raising him." He didn't say it to make a point. He said it because it was the only explanation that was actually true, and he didn't see the value in any other kind. Renee looked at him for a long moment. Whatever she had prepared to say next didn't come. She turned and walked back to the dining table and opened her laptop, and that was the end of the conversation. Cole went back up the ladder. That evening, Cole was finishing up outside when he noticed Brody sitting alone on the porch steps with his sketchbook closed on his knees, looking out at the water. Cole was about to call him in when Renee came through the front door, carrying 2 plates. She set one down next to Brody without a word. Pasta, something she'd clearly made from whatever was in the kitchen, and then she pulled the other porch chair around and sat down beside him, facing the lake. She didn't explain herself. She didn't offer conversation. She just sat there, eating, looking at the water, the same way Brody was looking at it. Cole stood at the corner of the house and watched them for a moment, the man who had built his life around showing up, and the woman who had apparently decided for reasons she hadn't explained to anyone to sit down. He went back to coiling his wire and didn't say anything about it, but something had shifted in the house after that in the way air shifts before weather changes. Not dramatic, just different. The story had quietly stopped being about a clock. By the 5th day, the shape of who Renee actually was had started to come through the edges of what she showed. It wasn't anything she said directly. It was the phone call she took outside, stepping off the porch and walking toward the water with her voice low and her posture shifting into something more formal, a different version of her than the one that ate pasta on the steps. It was the way she referred to the property not as her mother's house, but as the asset. It was the laptop screen Cole caught a glimpse of once when he walked through the dining room spreadsheets, a company logo in the corner, a name he recognized from a billboard he'd passed on the interstate outside Burlington. Ray Duffin confirmed it when Cole stopped in for supplies later that week. He said he'd heard the owner of the lake house was some kind of executive out of New York. Big real estate company. Ray said it like it was interesting information. Cole said thanks and loaded his truck. He didn't bring it up with Renee. It wasn't his business, and she hadn't lied to him. She'd just declined to explain herself, which was something he understood. What he didn't entirely understand was why a woman who ran a company would come alone to a house she'd been avoiding for 3 years and spend her days sitting at a dining table working in silence. But then Cole had learned early that the things people avoid longest are usually the things that matter most. On the 6th day, Brody finished a drawing and presented it to Renee while she was working. He set it on the table beside her laptop, without fanfare, the way he offered things, without asking for a reaction, just leaving it there. Cole came around the corner a moment later to call Brody in for lunch and saw the drawing before Renee did. It was the lake house rendered in Brody's particular style, slightly tilted the proportions off in the way that made everything look both childlike and deliberate. 3 figures out front, a big sun in the upper corner. Cole reached over to take it back, already forming an apology. Renee put her hand flat on the paper before he could lift it. Cole pulled his hand back. She didn't look up from the drawing for a long moment, and when she finally did, she looked at Brody, not at Cole, and said it was very good. Brody nodded seriously and went to wash his hands for lunch. Cole and Renee stood on either side of the drawing without speaking. There was nothing obvious to say. She kept the drawing there on the table beside her laptop for the rest of the day. That night, Cole was packing up his tools near the side of the house when he saw her sitting alone at the edge of the dock, her feet not quite reaching the water. Her shoulders dropped in a way he'd never seen on her in daylight. He didn't go out to her. He went back inside, and before he left, he turned the porch light on. He didn't examine the impulse. He just left it on and drove home. The next morning, she was already at the table when he arrived, coffee in hand, face composed. When Cole came through the front door with his toolbox, she stood briefly to move her bag from the chair nearest the hallway, clearing his path, and as he passed, she said quietly, "Good morning." That was all. But it was the first time she'd said it first. On the 7th day, the window in the back bedroom needed attention. The frame had warped badly enough that it wouldn't seal, and with Vermont winters, the way they were leaving it was not an option. It was fussy work, the kind that required 2 sets of hands at certain points to hold the frame in place while the other person set the screws. Renee appeared in the doorway of the room while Cole was assessing the problem, and when he explained what he needed, she set her things down on the dresser and came to hold the frame. Cole noticed she'd brought the small notebook with her dark cloth cover elastic band around it and set it on the dresser beside her phone. He didn't ask about it. They worked without much talk, and it was the first time the silence between them felt like something other than an absence. Cole directed when he needed her to shift her grip, and she did without question, without her usual instinct to manage the process. At some point, with the afternoon light coming through the warped glass in the particular way it does, before it goes gold, she said without preamble that her mother used to sit in this room. She said her mother had a chair right there by the window, and she would read in it every morning until the light got too bright. That was all she said. Cole tightened the second screw and told her she could ease her grip. She did. It was the most she had offered, and he had simply received it the way he received most things, without making it larger than it was. She seemed to notice that in the way people notice when they've handed someone something fragile and it didn't get dropped. The car that pulled up outside was a black sedan with New York plates. Cole heard it from the bedroom. Renee heard it too. Her posture changed before she even turned to look out the window. He saw it happen, that shift, from open to closed, as fast as a door swinging shut. The man who came to the door was in his 40s suit jacket over a collared shirt, carrying a leather folder. He introduced himself as Renee's assistant. He said there were documents that needed her attention and that there had been a development she needed to be aware of. He said it carefully, the way people say things when other people are in the room. Renee took the folder and went to the dining table to read. She spent 4 minutes on it. Cole busied himself with the window, but the bedroom was not a large room. When she came back, she thanked her assistant, who went to wait in the car. In her movement from the table back to the bedroom doorway, she left the notebook behind on the dresser. Not deliberately, not carelessly, just the way things get left when a person's attention has suddenly shifted somewhere else entirely. She told him she was accelerating the timeline. The sale of the property was moving forward faster than planned, and she needed to be back in New York by end of week. She would arrange for the remaining work to be completed by whoever the management company assigned. She said he'd be paid in full for the contracted work, plus the additional time. She said it clearly and professionally, which was how Cole understood that the conversation they'd had in the bedroom had already been filed somewhere she wasn't going to be opening again. He nodded and started breaking down his tools. She watched him for a moment, and something crossed her face that she didn't have a name ready for. Then she said it, not loudly, not dramatically the way people say the truest things they believe about themselves. She said, "You deserve someone better than me, Cole." She said it like a fact she'd long since made peace with, like she was doing him a favor by saying it out loud. Cole set his toolbox down on the floor. He didn't respond immediately. Brody came in from the porch, at that moment looked between the two of them, and asked if they were leaving. Cole said yes. Start gathering his things. Brody went. Cole picked up his toolbox. He looked at Renee one more time, and then he walked out of the bedroom without saying the thing that was sitting in his chest, because he wasn't sure yet that he had the right to say it. And he wasn't the kind of man who said things he hadn't fully decided on. Outside, he loaded the truck in the late afternoon light. Brody climbed into the passenger seat and looked out the window at the lake and said, "Is Miss Renee leaving?" Cole buckled his seatbelt, started the engine, and said he thought so. Brody was quiet for a moment, then asked why. Cole pulled out onto the gravel lane and said honestly that he didn't entirely know. Cole went back the next morning alone. Brody was at his aunt's place for the day, which was how Cole had arranged it quietly without explanation, because he didn't have one yet that made sense out loud. The house felt different without anyone in it. Not empty the way abandoned houses feel empty, but the other kind, the kind where something was recently present and is now specifically gone. He moved through the rooms, finishing what was left, tightening the last 2 junction boxes in the upstairs hall, checking the breaker panel one final time, running through the punch list with the particular thoroughness of a man who takes pride in leaving things better than he found them. He saved the back bedroom for last. The window he and Renee had fixed together was sealed clean. Now, no draft, no warp. He ran his hand along the frame, and it held. He stood there for a moment, looking at the chair by the window, the one she'd said her mother used to sit in every morning until the light got too bright, and then he turned to start packing up. That was when he saw it. It had slid partway under the dresser, small enough that it would have been easy to miss the notebook with the dark cloth cover and the elastic band around it, the one she'd set on the dresser when they were fixing the window and left behind when the assistant's arrival pulled her attention somewhere else. He picked it up and stood with it in his hand for a moment, not opening it, just holding it. Then he opened it. The inside cover had a name written in handwriting he didn't recognize, older. Looser, the kind of handwriting that belongs to a different generation. Below it, a date from more than 30 years back. The pages were a mix of things, notes in the older handwriting, photographs tucked between pages. A woman by the lake younger than Cole had imagined her laughing at something off camera. And then, near the middle of the notebook, a page in different handwriting. Tighter, more controlled. Renee's, a single line. The only place I didn't have to be anyone. Cole read the line twice. He stood in the room where her mother used to sit in the mornings, in the house Renee had been paying taxes on for 3 years without coming back to. And he understood something he hadn't had the full shape of before. She hadn't left because she was cold. She hadn't left because she didn't feel anything. She had left because this place had gotten close enough to matter, and mattering was the thing she had spent years learning to leave before it could leave her first. He tried her number. It went to voicemail after 3 rings, not the full ring cycle, which meant she'd seen the call. He didn't leave a message, There was nothing he could say in a voicemail that would be the right thing, and he knew it. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the deposit receipt still sitting on the workbench where he'd left it, and then he looked at the empty spot on the shelf where the clock should have been. Gerald in Montpellier had called 2 days ago to say it was ready. Cole hadn't picked it up yet. He drove to Montpellier that afternoon. Gerald had the clock wrapped in brown paper and set it on the counter with the care of someone returning something that belonged to a museum. Cole paid the remaining balance, $170, and drove back to the lake house. He set the clock back on the shelf in exactly the position Renee had adjusted it to on that first day, less than an inch to the left of where it had been sitting when Cole first arrived. He wound it the way Gerald had shown him. The ticking started up small and steady in the quiet room. He placed the notebook open on the table beside it, open to the page with her line on it. Then he picked up his toolbox, turned off the lights, and locked the door behind him. No note, no explanation, just the clock running again in an empty room and the notebook open to the one thing she hadn't meant anyone else to read. He left the porch light on when he went, the same as he always did, the same as the night she'd sat alone at the edge of the dock, and he hadn't gone out to her. It was the only language he had for, "I'm still here." 2 days later, Renee called him. She didn't say much when he picked up. She said she'd gone back to sign the final transfer documents, and she'd found the clock. Her voice was level in the way it always was, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before, a thinness like a surface that had been under pressure for a long time and was no longer entirely sure of itself. She said she'd seen the notebook left open. She asked him to come. Cole drove out to the lake house in the early evening when the light off the water was the color of something almost finished. Her car was the only one in the drive. The assistant's black sedan was gone. He knocked, and she opened the door, and they stood for a moment in the threshold, the way people stand. When they've said things they can't unsay and are figuring out what comes next. She'd been sitting at the dining table, he could tell. The notebook was there closed now beside a cup of coffee gone cold. The clock on the shelf was running. He could hear it from across the room, that small, steady tick that a house like this had been built to contain. She didn't offer him coffee or a seat. She just stood near the table and looked at him, and he could see the effort it was taking her to hold herself in the shape she was used to holding. She said she didn't understand why he'd done it. She said she'd meant what she told him. She wasn't someone who could offer what a man like him deserved, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She said she'd watched him with Brody for a week, and she knew what that kind of steadiness looked like, and she knew what she was, and they were not the same thing. She said all of this carefully, making her case the way someone argues a position they've rehearsed, because the alternative is admitting it might be wrong. Cole let her finish. He was standing near the door with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he didn't interrupt, and he didn't look away. When she stopped, the room held the clocks ticking for a moment. Then he said it, the thing he hadn't said in the bedroom when she'd first handed it to him, the thing he'd been carrying for 2 days, looking at from different angles until he was sure it was true. He said, "I'm not looking for better, I'm looking for real." Renee looked at him. The composure she'd been holding didn't collapse. It was more like it became unnecessary, the way scaffolding comes down when the wall is finally standing on its own. She didn't have an answer ready, and he could see that. And he didn't try to fill the space where one would have gone. He just stood there in the same room where a clock that had been broken was running again, waiting to see what she would do with the truth he'd just handed her. She sat down at the table, not as a gesture of defeat, just sat down the way people sit when they're done, holding themselves up for an audience. Cole pulled out the chair across from her and sat down too. Outside, the light off the lake had gone from gold to gray, and the room was getting dark in the gentle way. Rooms get dark in early fall, and neither of them moved to turn on a light. They talked for a long time, not about the house or the company, not about anything that required a decision or a plan. Just two people finally telling the truth in the same room, and the room large enough to hold it. The house didn't sell. The paperwork was already in motion, but Renee made a call the next morning and put it on hold. She didn't explain her reasons to the management company because she didn't need to. Cole found out when Ray Duffin mentioned it at the supply store 2 weeks later, the way Ray mentioned everything casually, as if it were common knowledge, as if the fact of it were less interesting than the weather. Cole loaded his truck and didn't say much about it. He saw Renee again in late September. She called to say the heating system needed to be looked at before winter. The boiler was original to the house, and she didn't trust it. She said it in the same brisk way she'd said everything in the beginning, and Cole said he could be there Thursday, and that was the full exchange. He showed up Thursday with his toolbox, and Brody, who had a half day at school, and had asked without prompting if they were going back to the lake house. Cole said yes, and Brody had gotten his jacket and his sketchbook without further discussion, as if the matter were settled. The boiler was in worse shape than the listing suggested. It would need 2 full days, and a part ordered from Burlington. Cole explained this to Renee, who was at the dining table with her laptop, and she nodded and said to go ahead and order the part. The clock was still on the shelf, still running. It was the first thing Cole had looked at when he came through the door, and he thought she probably knew that. Brody sat up on the front porch, the way he always had, sketchbook open feet tucked under him on the chair. At some point in the afternoon, Renee brought 2 cups of something hot out and set one next to Brody, then pulled the other chair around and sat looking at the lake. Brody said something that made her laugh, a short, real laugh. Nothing performed about it. Cole heard it from inside the house where he was working, and he didn't stop what he was doing, but something in his chest settled the way a joint settles when it finally fits the way it's supposed to. Later, when Cole was packing up for the day, Brody came inside and asked if Miss Renee was going to be here more now. Cole zipped up the toolbox and thought about it for a real moment before he answered. He said he didn't know for certain. Brody considered this with the particular seriousness he brought to things that mattered, then nodded once, as if uncertain was an acceptable condition, as long as it was honest. Cole picked up the toolbox and headed for the door. He stopped in the main room on the way out. The clock on the shelf was ticking in its small, steady way, the same clock that had been in pieces on this floor not 2 months ago. The same clock Cole had driven 80 miles round trip to have repaired, because his son had broken something that mattered to someone, and that was reason enough. The last of the afternoon light was coming through the window at an angle that made the brass face catch and hold it. Cole stood there for a second, not analyzing it, just taking it in the room, with the light in it, the clock running, the sound of Renee's voice drifting in from the porch, mixed with Brody's, the particular quality of a house that has people in it, again, after a long time of having none. He turned off the kitchen light, left the porch, light on the way he always did, and walked out into the evening. Behind him, through the closed door, he could still hear the clock, still keeping time, still running like it had no intention of stopping.